Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. I'm really excited about the show today. We're going to be talking with Dr. Harvey Fishman about the ocular microbiome. Dr. Fishman received his undergraduate bachelor's degree in chemistry with an emphasis in neuroscience, and then he earned a PhD from the Department of Chemistry at Stanford, working in the area of lasers, microfluidics, and neuroscience. Dr. Fishman also conducted a postdoctoral research in the Department of Neurobiology, working in the field of nerve regeneration. And then he earned an MD from Stanford Medical School and completed a medical internship at St. Mary's Hospital in San Francisco, including training from San Francisco General Hospital. After his medical internship, Dr. Fishman joined the Department of Ophthalmology at Stanford and founded the Ophthalmic Tissue Engineering Laboratory, OTEL. And as director of OTEL, he was awarded one of the first BioX grants and became the founder of the Artificial Retina Prosthesis Project, which has recently gone into clinical trials for patients with macular degeneration. After completing his residency training in eye surgery and medical treatment for eye diseases at Stanford, Dr. Fishman started his own ophthalmology practice in Palo Alto, where he continues to lead advancements in ocular surface disease and novel diagnostics for dry eye, cancer detection, and the ocular microbiome. Dr. Fishman also has an interest in digital health and has co-founded 3 companies in teleophthalmology. He has co-authored 34 peer-reviewed publications, 11 U.S. patents, and his research has been highlighted in Scientific American, The Economist, JAMA, Technology Review, and MIT Enterprise, and in Ophthalmology Times. And I'm really looking forward to this. I know you've heard now of the gut microbiome. We've talked about the skin microbiome. There's microbiomes in the lungs, the vaginal microbiome, and the nasal microbiome. And it turns out, not surprisingly, there's also an ocular or eye microbiome that has a big impact on eye diseases like cataracts and macular degeneration. And that's what we're going to be talking with Dr. Fishman about today. So hope you enjoy the show. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. I hope this podcast and my blog and books have been helpful resources for you and will continue to be. But if you've been struggling with a chronic health problem and are feeling stuck, consider coming to work with my team and me at the California Center for Functional Medicine. We work with patients all over the U.S. and have experience treating a wide range of conditions, including GI problems, autoimmunity, hypothyroidism, cognitive mood and behavioral issues, weight gain and metabolic dysfunction, and more. Our unique model teams clinicians with nurse practitioners and health coaches, all of whom are trained in my ADAPT framework approach to provide a high level of care to our patients. This means more support between appointments, personalized guidance on diet, lifestyle, and behavior change, a cutting-edge patient portal with 24/7 access to your labs and records, handouts and resources to guide your protocols, and a team of practitioners working together on your case. We're currently accepting new patients, so if you'd like to learn more, visit chriskresser.com/become-a-patient. Dr. Fishman, welcome to Revolution Health Radio. I'm so happy you could join us. I've really been looking forward to this.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. This is wonderful.
So my audience has been well aware of the gut microbiome for many years. We've also talked about the skin microbiome. We've talked about the vaginal microbiome, the lung microbiome, more recently the nasal microbiome. And so it's not surprising to learn that there's also an ocular microbiome. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you more about this and how it contributes to eye disease, because in the conventional world, the options for preventing eye disease in the first place and then addressing them, I think have come a long way, but maybe still leave something to be desired. So I'd first love to start out with just hearing a little bit more about your background, how you became interested in the ocular microbiome in your work as an ophthalmologist, and what led you down this path.
That's great. So I have a pretty interesting background where I started off in the world as a physical chemist studying neuroscience. Mm-hmm. And so I was in an analytical chemistry, microfluidic laser lab at Stanford and really got interested in how to measure molecules almost at the single molecule level. We were looking at vesicular and synaptic release of neurotransmitters and what the chemical basis of learning and memory was. That was sort of my background. And then I then sort of did some interesting work in neurobiology, looking at retinal cells and how they regrow and nerve regeneration. And so I've had a lot of sort of the technical background and analytical chemistry background. And then the last couple of years, I started getting very interested in the microbiome of the intestine and the gut, and which led me into this whole world of what is actually happening in the eyes. What is there an ocular microbiome, and is there a biome that controls disease in the eye that's similar to that in the gut? And what's interesting is that I didn't necessarily sort of think about it in those ways. I actually got into this, my research that I'm working on right now is we're actually looking at how to measure cancer on the eye. Huh. And we're using some of the analytical techniques that I developed or have been, working on for my whole sort of academic career, which is, how do you measure very small amounts of materials in microenvironments? And so I naturally led to this concept of how do you measure cancers on the eye. And we started using similar techniques and sort of the Illumina high throughput sequencing technology using 16S DNA and our RNA to look at different things on the cancer. Of course, this led me right into how they are looking at the ocular biome. And so that's sort of what got my interest sparked. And then the other thing that's sort of interesting is I've been working with a company called Microbiome to do some studies where I'm actually looking at the intestinal microbiome and how that compares to disease in the eye. So that's sort of a whirlwind tour of how I got interested.
Right. Yeah, that's a fascinating background, and is often the case. It seems like in some way you could have never designed this career path or predicted it would happen, but when you look at it in retrospect, it seems like each step kind of perfectly informed the next step.
That's right. It's actually really interesting. I never, in my wildest dreams, would have thought that I'd be doing genomics. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of my previous advisors always laughs because, I'm doing genomics, and I was a physical chemist and a microanalytical, guy in the 90s.
Right.
I was a young whippersnapper.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the ocular microbiome and, what we know about it so far and what we don't know about it. Do we have any sense of the number of species, microorganisms, of what the functions of the ocular microbiome are? I imagine it's significantly less developed as a field of study than the gut microbiome, but what do we know so far?
Right. It's really the beginning of this field. I mean, what's interesting about the microbiome of the eye is that, we've been interested in, as ophthalmologists, not me personally, but as an ophthalmology community, we've been very interested in the bacteria that lives on the eye. And the reason is that most of our intraocular surgeries, like cataract surgery, vitreal retinal surgery, corneal surgery, when you make incisions into the eye, most of the serious and infections that occur because of exogenous either bacteria that live on the lashes, the eyelid margin, or in the cornea. And so we've been very interested in this for years, and they've done a lot of interesting work. But the concept of the ocular microbiome, whether there's like some low-level core bacteria and microbiological, species that lives in and around the eye, that's really kind of a new concept. And one of the papers that has come out just recently was actually by Mark Wilcox. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was a Nature paper in 2017. Mm-hmm. And they looked at basically the temporal stability and composition of the ocular surface microbiome. And it was probably one of the best papers, if not the most sentinel paper in this field. And what they found is, there's a couple things they found is that, first of all, the ocular biome is very different, if at all, than the microbiome of the intestine. And one of the things that they found is that and in addition to other work that's been done, is that it's actually a pretty low number of species. I mean, there's a diverse number of species, but it's a low number. It's just the regular numbers.
Right.
And then there was some work that was done by Russell Van Gelder, who's also shown similar work. But basically, they sort of talk about it as a possibacteria microbiome. It's just a very small number.
Uh-huh. And I mean, this is interesting. There's some parallel too with the gut. I mean, for most of the 20th century, we're very well aware of the existence of pathogenic bacteria and parasites and other organisms that could cause dysfunction in the gut. And most of the focus there was on identifying those pathogens and then, eradicating them if possible with antibiotics or treating the diseases that were caused by them. Whereas now, at least the awareness has shifted to some extent toward, how do we support and nourish the protective microbiome and look at it more in the context of an ecosystem where we understand that if the health of the ecosystem is the primary focus, then that may actually be the most effective way of protecting against pathogenic activity. Do you think that something similar is going to happen with the ocular microbiome, or that it's just because it's not as significant in terms of the volume of the number of organisms, and we may not have as much ability to influence it with things like diet and lifestyle, we're not going to go down a similar path there?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. And, that's really what a lot of myself and many other people are working on, whether you can influence it. And I have some anecdotal discussions on that, papers as well that actually would suggest that you may be able to do the exact same thing for the ocular health as you do for the the gut health. That it changes the entire. And so and let me give you a couple examples. There's some really significant diseases of the eye, like for instance dry eye disease, which is actually an area that I'm super interested in and really focusing a lot of my academic and clinical research in. But dry eye disease they think there's a very big component of how the ocular microbiome, interacts with the cornea and the lids and so forth. But there are also a bunch of other diseases like episcleritis, chronic follicular conjunctivitis, pterygium, Tygeson's disease, scleritis, even things as interesting as macular degeneration and glaucoma. A lot of people are starting to have a lot of these diseases are actually idiopathic. Now, not macular degeneration necessarily, but like episcleritis and dry eye disease. There are these so-called, idiopathic diseases. And what we think is that it's really controlled by dysbiosis of the ocular surface biome.
Wow, that's interesting. And for listeners, idiopathic meaning we don't really know.
Which means we don't know exactly.
It's a fancy way of saying we don't know where this comes from or how it starts. But certainly,
right.
It's fascinating, and by now not surprising, given what we talked about at the beginning of the show. We know now about the microbiome is not just in the gut; that there's microbiome in virtually any surface that interacts with the exterior world, whether it's the gut, the inside of the gut technically is outside of the body. We've talked about that on the show, which is always kind of fascinating, especially if you haven't thought about that. And then the lungs, which of course interface with the exterior environment, and the skin, the vagina, there's a penis microbiome, and clearly these organisms are playing some important role. And clearly there's something about the modern lifestyle that is antithetical to the health of the microbiome. So I imagine with the ocular microbiome, do we know anything? Is it influenced by the same factors? Like, does systemic antibiotic use contribute to a degradation of the quality of the ocular microbiome? Are any kind of eye products that people use, like drops, can they interfere? What do we know about that?
Right. Those are great, certainly areas that people are looking at. I mean, so there's so many aspects of the eye in terms of the ocular microbiome of the eye that makes it complex, because the thing about the microbiome of the eye is that it not only is our what we think a core microbiome exists in a very low level. There's a lot of other bacteria and other species of organisms that sort of quote unquote contaminate those measurements and also the surface. And so there's a lot of one of the interesting things, there's a lot of sort of noise in the sense that there's the noise from contaminants at any one time on the eye can overwhelm the signal of the actual microbiome. But what does seem to occur is that it's very possible that when people have sort of acute issues, it's because they do get some sort of a dysregulation of their normal biome by these sort of contaminants. And the sort of things that can really change the ocular surface biome is exactly the sort of stuff you're mentioning. Like if you use makeup, if you use products, Latisse, for instance, Latisse, which people use to make their eyelashes grow longer, contain a lot of, basically causes the eyelashes to have more inflammation, more debris on them. And those are basically culture plates for bacteria on the eyelashes. So that really does change it. And then a lot of what you're mentioning really is sort of this dry eye disease, realm, which is that all these different products that people use, including, unnecessary eye drops for things like viral bacterial conjunctivitis, which, you wouldn't use antibiotic, but that changes the microbiome. And the other area that's very fascinating is parasites. And it turns out that, Demodex, and I'm sure we had many shows on Demodex, but Demodex is a big, big deal. And there's an interesting sort of life cycle of Demodex in the lashes and how that relates not only to the skin microbiome, but actually of people who have dysbiosis of their intestine. It's just incredibly fascinating. And it plays into the whole ocular rosacea story as well.
Not too long ago, we had periodontist Al Dannenberg, who's been through my clinician training program and is a really knowledgeable guy. And he has looked at the connection between the gut microbiome and the oral microbiome, and has found from his perspective and from what the research is showing that when there's a disruption in the oral microbiome, it's usually or often driven by dysfunction of the gut microbiome rather than the other way around. Although, certainly we know that infections in the mouth can influence the gut and other parts of the body. But because stomach acid, protects against some, hopefully, if it's sufficient, a lot of what we would swallow in the saliva and from the mouth, that the relationship is probably more strongly influenced in the other direction. Has there been much work done on the influence of the gut microbiome on the ocular microbiome?
So that's a huge area that there's a lot of really interesting work. But just to kind of go back to what you said, there was a really interesting paper that came out that talked about the oral microbiome links to neurodegeneration and glaucoma. So we actually know that there are people with worse oral disease and dental disease actually have higher rates of primary open-angle glaucoma, than other people. And that was a very well done study that was recently published. But to talk about, essentially one of the things that we've known forever, and as a medical student, we learned very early in the game the connection between ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, and uveitis.
Right.
And this is and so you may have touched upon this before, but that is one of the biggest, one of the most clear-cut associations that we have in ophthalmology. In fact, ophthalmologists often sometimes will look like brilliant clinicians when the person comes in and we see uveitis, and then we find out, we do a little bit of a history, and it turns out that, they have Crohn's, and then we send them to the GI specialist, and the GI guy thinks we're brilliant.
Right.
We discovered Crohn's disease by looking in their eye, and yet that's a huge association. But what's interesting is that there are multi-system disorders, autoimmune diseases that are associated with uveitis that are absolutely related to the gut and other areas. And so that's an area that NIH is doing. There's a big push to look at the associations, in particular, some of the work they're doing with T cell activation, both protective T cells and non-protective T cells, and how that influences, uveitis. And they've been looking at some really interesting, like experimental autoimmune uveitis models, the EUA, so to speak. And they looked at how the regulatory T cells in the gut and other tissues really affects the uveitis, uveogenic, and so forth.
So for those, I think there's probably a fair number of listeners who are not that familiar with eye disease, uveitis being an inflammation of the middle layer of the eye, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And with the connection between the gut and depression, for example, the speculation is that in terms of a mechanism is that inflammatory cytokines are produced in the gut, and they enter the bloodstream, perhaps because the barrier is permeable, and they travel through the blood and they cross the blood-brain barrier and they suppress the activity of the frontal cortex. And that's one way that gut pathology can lead to anxiety and depression. In the case of the connection between the gut and eye disease, or let's take ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, which are both autoimmune GI pathologies, is the speculation that the systemic inflammation caused by the autoimmune disease is what's causing the inflammation in the eye? Or is it that something related to a disruption of the microbiome leading to maybe the production of certain chemicals or inflammatory cytokines, or something that's more specific to the microbial ecology of the gut is the contributing factor, or do we just not really know?
Well, one of the thoughts, and there was a paper that came, and these are all, what's interesting, really recent papers like 2015, 2016, but there's that commensal microbiota and bacteria in the gut activate T cells. These T cells then circulate and then actually pass into and through into the retina and other parts of the eye to then activate directly. So it's definitely via the immune system, but the immune system there are very specific immune cells that actually can penetrate into the eye. There's always been this thought that the eye is immunologically, pristine, and that really is obviously not the case, but there are very selective T cells that can in fact get into the eye or pass into the eye. And so that's what we think that is going on, is that there's a dysregulation in the microbiome of the gut. As you sort of just pointed out, you get T cell activation, and then it goes into, and it actually activates the local immune system in the eye. A really interesting situation that we see with respect to that, we actually can see diseases like, for instance, there's one awful disease called sympathetic ophthalmia, which is a disease where if you injure one eye, activation of the T cells from one eye actually can go to the other eye, and you can actually lose the other eye. So you could actually have a situation where it's awful. That's why people have to get their eyes enucleated and they're taken out when they have a trauma, and they have to do that within about 10 to 15 days or sooner, because they can get this autoimmune, activation that can actually blind them in the other eye. So it's just fascinating how that works. But that is sort of the same idea in the gut, that you get this activation and it causes inflammation. One of the things that we know, Chris, is that, and this is in my own personal experience in my practice, and I've seen this over and over and over again, is that my uveitis patients, they always come in with it's almost always some kind of a gut-related situation that sets off their uveitis, their inflammation. So they'll come in, I said, what did you do last weekend? I was in Las Vegas, and then we ate a lot of carbohydrates. And these are patients who are very strict about being on a gluten-free diet. And it's just, they cheated, so to speak. They had a bad weekend, fun weekend, but now they're paying the price. And then they come back and they get uveitis. And I can't tell you the number of times I've seen that. I mean, it's just clear cut. And that's actually with things like, in particular, HLA-B27 uveitis. I don't know if you've covered that, but that's a big area.
I'd love to hear a little bit. I'm familiar with HLA-B27 and AS, ankylosing spondylitis, and the connection there. And in fact, in our clinic, we'll often test patients for HLA-B27 if they have joint pain, and if they test positive for Klebsiella bacteria on the stool tests. I forget the name of the physician in London who discovered that connection, but then we'll often put them on a low starch diet, and we'll treat the Klebsiella, and their joint pain will go away, or at least it will significantly improve. But tell me more about HLA-B27 and the eye.
Well, so that's like our biggest immune screening. We screen for that. Every single uveitis patient gets screened for HLA-B27. In fact, 50% of every non-necrotizing anterior uveitis, which is just a fancy word for, basically idiopathic. I mean, we don't know what the cause is. It's almost always related to an HLA-B27 positive uveitis. And so we see that all the time. And and then those patients are particularly sensitive to changes in their diet. And a lot of those patients, I will, really push for, strong control of mostly at least in my practice, we always start off with a gluten type restriction, because that seems to be one of the big areas that sets off uveitis. And so, but we have HLA-B27 is such a prominent factor in most of our inflammation. You can also get scleritis with HLA-B27. You can get uveitis. You can get episcleritis. Any of the autoimmune diseases around the eye seem to be linked to that marker.
Right. So just for the listeners, if your eyes are glazing over here, we're geeking out a little bit, but I want to back up. And HLA-B27 is a gene, and it's one that plays a really important role in immune function. Its prevalence varies around the world, based on different ethnic groups and populations. I think it's about 8% in Caucasians, 2 to 9% in Chinese, 4% in North Africans. And as I was mentioning before, it's the association that I was most familiar with. I'm really fascinated to learn about the connection with uveitis is with ankylosing spondylitis. And back in the 80s, there was a physician in London whose name I'm unfortunately forgetting at the moment. And he was treating patients with AS. And by accident, some of them he put on a low carb diet for weight loss, and their AS improved dramatically. And then he did some more research, and he found that there was a greater abundance of Klebsiella in stool samples of patients with AS. And then he found that Klebsiella bacteria have preference for starch. And so he put these, and the patients that he put on a low carb diet were, of course, eating a lot less starch. And so the low starch intake starved the Klebsiella and reduced the Klebsiella, which then reduced the autoimmune attack against the HLA-27 expressed enzymes that were in the joints, and thus, reduced the symptoms of AS or ankylosing spondylitis. But there was later research that showed that sometimes can be connected to Crohn's disease. So I wonder if, and you just told me that Crohn's is connected to uveitis.
Yeah.
It seems like there's some very interesting connection going on here, and that it may possibly a low carb, low starch diet, if it works for AS and HLA-B27, might be effective for uveitis.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, I basically, in a very non-scientific way, have my patients try these diets, and often they don't want to go on to these heavy-duty immunosuppressants like methotrexate or Imuran. And they want not natural, but they want a way to control the inflammation, not through these other sources. And so they will grab it. And a lot of the way I practice is I've learned so much from the multitude of patients who tell me. Many of the patients who have seen you as well. And I learn from them what works, and I can then pass that on to other people. But in terms of, the gut association with HLA-B27 and so forth, the other thing that's fascinating, you were mentioning Klebsiella. It turns out that Klebsiella, as well as other bacteria, and in particular, there's a big connection with blepharitis and dry eye disease. And in fact, they did a study where they looked at patients. Bacillus was the other one. They looked at a study where they looked at patients who had dry eye disease, and it turned out that Bacillus and Klebsiella were the huge association with blepharitis and dry eye disease.
Wow.
And so, and just as an aside, another very interesting thing, because I'm very interested in dry eye disease, and a lot of people with ocular rosacea, there's that story of the microbiome of your gut causing or being eaten. So the bacteria that actually gets eaten by the parasites, which are the Demodex on your eyelashes and your hair follicles, they eat the bacteria. Then the parasites puke up the bacteria, and then the products and the exogenous cell components from the bacteria then irritate the eyelashes and the meibomian glands, which are these little glands in your eyelid, and cause severe dry eye. So that's this interesting life cycle between bacteria, Demodex, and the other thing that I've looked at is, and I know that you guys have talked about SIBO, and that's there seems to be this association with SIBO bacteria, blepharitis, Demodex, and ocular rosacea, and dry eye disease.
Yeah. Fascinating. I mean, there's so many directions, but it all really comes back to, I think one of the things I like to emphasize, these discussions are fascinating and they're important, and these lines of research are really crucial to figuring out what's going on. And at the same time, it comes back to the same basic steps that we need to take. Eat a nutrient-dense, anti-inflammatory diet. Make sure you're taking care of your gut microbiome. Avoid unnecessary antibiotics, make sure to eat plenty of fermented foods and fermentable fibers. It can be easy to get overwhelmed by the complexity of all of these connections. But the good news is that usually it's just the same simple steps that we need to take in order to protect our health.
Absolutely. One of the things that we found, and you'll just be amazed, is, ophthalmologists, we have been running the largest nutritional study in the history of mankind. And it was for macular degeneration. That statement is not a trivial one. So, I don't know if you've talked about the arids and essentially the use of lutein and zeaxanthin in your diet, but there's a lot of interesting connections between the intestine and macular degeneration. And
Yes.
There's a big suggestion that the intestinal dysbiosis, as seen in AMD patients, and when you're doing the supplementation, you're really supplementing the intestinal microbiome to reduce inflammation in the retina, which is actually the cause of macular degeneration. So it's just incredibly fascinating. Every time I leave my patient, I say, look, there's two things I want you guys to leave this office with, because I don't have the bandwidth, obviously, that your practice has in terms of, I have to focus on different things, but I tell them spinach pills, which is just spinach, and omega-3 fatty acid. Omega-3 fatty acid is a very interesting controller of eyelid health and dry eye disease.
Right.
Despite the fact that there was a recent paper that came out that disputed that, and I would really argue that was not a very well done. It was a study that was well done, but they had a lot of problems with it. But so my two big go-to things, at least in my practice, are spinach and fish.
Well, that's certainly fits into the context of the nutrient-dense anti-inflammatory diet. I mean, it's really fascinating to me how the change, I think, that's happening in medicine, this is not just in functional and integrative medicine, but even in conventional medicine. We started out, allopathic medicine grew out of this Cartesian dualistic framework where, the body is basically just a bunch of disconnected parts that are kind of loosely connected, but not really, influencing each other. And now we're really starting to understand that the traditional systems of medicine, they certainly didn't get everything right, but the one thing that they did get right was this idea of holism, and that every part of the body is connected to and influences the body as a whole. And now we're seeing this, I think, really play out with, look, it's Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis increase your risk of eye inflammation. We now have the inflammatory cytokine model of depression that shows that inflammation in the gut can cause, inflammation in the brain and symptoms that mimic depression. And we've got connections between, dysfunction in the HPA axis and stress and all kinds of skin conditions like eczema and psoriasis. And I mean, the list goes on and on. And now we're adding to this the connection between the oral microbiome and the gut microbiome and inflammation in the eye, which even just, I think, 20 or 30 years ago would have been completely dismissed as
crazy,
fantasy. Woo-woo kind of out there stuff. And it's just encouraging to me that we're really starting to move in all, no matter what kind of perspective on medicine we're talking about, into a more holistic view of the body.
It was an interesting paper where a researcher looked at treating, it wasn't a corneal ulcer, but they were treating sort of a conjunctivitis using a probiotic eye drop. There's a disease called vernal keratoconjunctivitis, and that's a pretty tough one to treat. It's vernal meaning spring, and basically it's allergic conjunctivitis. A lot of kids get it. And the way we typically treat that is with steroids and so forth, which obviously you don't want to do with children. And so there was a paper back in 2008 where they looked at using a probiotic eye drop, and they found it was essentially equivalent to some of the other drops that they were using, which to me makes complete sense. I mean, I had a very interesting case recently of a patient who had actually an open globe. She actually had some sort of a tube that was put in for glaucoma, and it had eroded through the conjunctiva. But the bottom line is she had an open globe, and she had an open globe for essentially, 6 months. And nothing happened. She didn't get an infection, nothing. And that was because her, for whatever reason, she had a very well controlled ocular biome. And so, as they're saying, they're realizing the oral, one of the interesting questions that we're now looking at is how does the intestinal or oral or skin biome relate to the ocular microbiome?
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think it's a pretty clear situation. I mean, we know, and I've had private conversations with some pretty famous microbiologists.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that comes out of your intestine is going to be in your eyes.
Wow.
I mean, yeah. So basically, just think of it that way. I mean, it doesn't sound great, and I joke with my patients that you're basically getting poop in your eyes, and it happens all the time, every single day.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. Not to be completely crass, but that is the connection.
Yeah, that's interesting. And this kind of the probiotic eye drop concept reminds me of, I've talked about this before, the nasal microbiome and the connection between the nasal microbiome and sinusitis. Dr. Susan Lynch at UCSF has done some really interesting work in this area. She did a fascinating study with, that was both animal and human. And they had an animal model of sinusitis, and they found that the main difference between the animals with sinusitis and the controls was not, and this was true in humans too, was not the presence of certain pathogens. So it wasn't that the people with sinusitis had much higher levels of fungus or certain species of pathogenic bacteria. The determining the biggest difference between the two groups was microbial diversity. So the people who were the controls, the people who didn't have sinusitis, had a much richer diversity of healthy protective bacteria, whereas the people who had sinusitis had a lower diversity. And even when the presence of pathogenic species was basically the same, there was no difference between the two groups. The difference was that the healthy people had much higher levels of protective bacteria. And then she went a step further, and in the animals, they treated them with antibiotics until they were basically had depleted the microbiome in both the healthy controls and the animals with sinusitis. And in one group of animals, they just let they didn't do anything. They just let the bacteria grow back as they would. And then the other group, they inoculated them with a protective species, Lactobacillus sakei, which they had observed in higher numbers in the healthy controls. And those animals that were inoculated with that nasal probiotic didn't develop sinusitis at anything like the rate that the other animals that were not inoculated with that. So, I mean, it's really that really actually speaks to probiotics and both maintaining and then restoring a healthy microbiome as being a more effective strategy than using antibiotics or antimicrobials to try to get rid of pathogens.
Right. There are two interesting, when you mention those two things, there are two interesting things that come to mind. The first one, just to let you know that there was a paper that came out in Nature 2016, which said exactly the same thing. They were looking at Sjogren's disease, which for your listeners is one of the most severe forms of dry eye disease and other dry parts of your body. And they found the exact same finding, that people with the severity of Sjogren's disease was inversely correlated with microbial diversity in your gut.
Wow.
And it was just super clear that this was the case. And, and we know, and I know from my own clinical experiences, that people who do have a much higher control level, people who do a better job in terms of their diet, people who are more precise about their foods that they eat and so forth, do much better with dry eye. And dry eye disease, for the longest time, we've been treating dry eye disease with omega-3s or any type of, omega-3 fatty acid, not necessarily in urine, but any sort of, derived that can lead to that. And what I always mention is that, is it actually the omega-3 acting directly in your eye, or is it some, basically an activation, a cascade, a bacterial, a biological cascade that's then causing improved function in the eye? I clearly believe that it's a cascade effect, because there's no way that just a simple little fish oil capsule could have that much of an improvement in people with dry eye disease.
Right.
one of the things that is interesting is that, you had talked about treating infections with, basically displacing, let's say, necessarily, bad bacteria with quote unquote good bacteria and so forth. Yeah. And that whole concept, which makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that we've seen is that in eye disease, especially in eye disease, in ocular surgery, we routinely treat our patients for, basically for medical legal reasons with antibiotics prior to surgery. Right. And it turns out that the studies are coming out that just is, there's no data whatsoever to support those claims. Yeah. And those are billions of dollars a year in antibiotics that were sold by pharmaceutical companies to basically do nothing. And maybe, who knows, but maybe actually not even improve outcome, but maybe we're making outcomes worse by selecting for bacteria that, if it does get into the eye, actually would be a much worse case situation. So right. That's really interesting data that we have.
That happens, of course, not just in the, the world of the eye, ocular issues, but of course in the oral, dental surgery. Yep. We're often asked, patients will often come and say, oh, I'm about to get this dental surgery. My dentist is just prescribing antibiotics prophylactically. And of course, I've had the thought, well, okay, does this become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Because we know that disruption of the oral microbiome with antibiotics can actually predispose you to an oral infection. And so by prophylactically prescribing an antibiotic, is that really prophylaxis, or is that actually making you more likely to develop an infection? And as you said, then not only have you reduced your body's ability to fight the infection if it does happen by, reducing the number of beneficial protective bacteria, you've also potentially contributed to creating a more resistant strain of pathogenic bacteria by killing the ones that were least, the types of pathogenic bacteria that were least robust, and just leaving the ones that were more robust.
Well, there's some evidence to suggest that may actually be the case. I mean, with eye surgery, we use povidone before surgery. That is the gold standard. And that at least cuts down sort of universally it doesn't select for, you know what I mean? You're not selecting for bacteria. You're basically wiping out. Yeah. And antibiotics, on the other hand, are probably selecting for it. So that's a good example of where, that theory of self-selecting bad bacteria really might be coming true. So it's very interesting, where we're going with especially with the eye, because there's so many quote unquote idiopathic diseases and infections that really relate to the biome, not only of the eye, but also of the gut being the cause of it.
Who knows? I mean, maybe someday you'll go to the dentist and you'll get a dental probiotic instead of antibiotic for an infection. Maybe you'll go to your ENT doctor with an ear infection. Instead of putting antibiotic eardrops, they'll put in probiotic eardrops. You'll go to the ophthalmologist, and instead of getting, antimicrobial treatment, you'll get probiotic eye drops. It seems like that's not far-fetched at this point.
Not at all. In fact, you might argue we're already doing that through indirectly by using our gut as a way to,
to modulate.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, this has been cool. Really, really fascinating, Dr. Fishman. I've enjoyed talking with you, and I think that listeners are really going to get a lot out of this, and it's hopeful. I feel hopeful when to know that there are folks like you who are exploring these new frontiers and really kind of pushing the boundaries and questioning some of the most basic assumptions that we've made, and finding a new path forward that could lead to better, safer treatments. So where can folks learn more about your work, or if people are in the Bay Area? It sounds like you definitely are still seeing some patients, but tell us where people can learn more.
Sure. Well, they can always find me on my website, which is www.fishmanvision.com. And then they can get involved in my practice in multiple ways. I definitely see patients at half the time I'm seeing patients, other half the time I'm doing research. So it
looks like you do some video consultations as well. Is that right?
I do some, yes, for people in California. I also have, I can do video consultations if they can't make it to the office. And that's a lot, especially for dry disease, very helpful.
Right. Great. Well, keep us posted on your research. Would love to stay in touch and have you back on the show at some point and keep track of your work. And these are really exciting developments.
I really appreciate the opportunity, and I wanted to thank you because we've shared some patients, and their lives have actually changed because of the work that you're doing with.
Fantastic. That's my pleasure. Take care. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.